What we have here, though, that's very, very important to understand is that Gog is Antichrist. He is the chief enemy. He is the head of the military. And in your notes, if you want to take a couple minutes, I'd like to lay this out to you, because if you can notice Ezekiel 38:17, let's discuss for a moment the proofs that Gog is Antichrist and that the Magog invasion is the same war as Armageddon. Number one, Gog appears in previous scriptures. Let's read Ezekiel 38:17. Thus says the Lord God, are you he of whom I've spoken in former days by my servants the prophets? Notice that that's plural. More than one prophet has spoken about Gog of Israel, who prophesied for years in those days that I would bring you against them. So for the first proof, folks, Putin needs to be in the Bible at least 2 other places. How many of you are with me now? Are you he who I've spoken about through the prophets, plural? How many of you know where the other 2 times of the invasion of Russia into Israel is? Now, how many of you know where Putin is elsewhere in the Bible? No. Why? Because God is teaching us here that the leader Gog appears elsewhere in the prophets. There's only one guy I know. He might be called the little horn. He might be called Antichrist. But in the prophets, Nahum, Micah, Isaiah, Daniel, over and over and over again, there's the leader of a coalition that's going to come against Messiah in the last days. Secondly, I noticed, Gog is prophesied by Moses and Balaam in Numbers 24:7. Now, I ask you to read a book, maybe some of you did, about Numbers 24:7. So I'm not going to take the time on this. If you didn't read it, you need to. Balaam gets up and he makes a prophecy. Notice what it says, and I've kind of added some commentary to it. This is not what the King James Version says. It uses Agog instead of Gog, but here's what it should say. Water will flow from his, Israel's buckets. This is Numbers 24:7 in Balaam's prophecy. Balaam was a pagan, and Balak, the king, said, go hire that guy to curse Israel. And every time Balaam gets up to curse Israel, he gives one of the most amazing Bible prophecies 4 times. And in that first one, this is what he says. Instead of cursing Israel, he gets up, Balaam, and says, water will flow from his, Israel's buckets. And his, Israel's seed, pointing to the Messiah, will be by many waters. And his, Israel's king, the Messiah, shall be higher than Gog, Israel's enemy. And his, the Messiah's kingdom, shall be exalted. So when God says, where's this Gog that I've talked about through the prophets? We have Moses and Balaam. There's 2 right there. Number 3, the invasion of Israel itself appears in previous scriptures. Let's look at Ezekiel 39 and verse 8. Surely it is coming, and it shall be done, says the Lord God. This is the day of which I've spoken of. So not only is God spoken about previously, but this very battle is spoken about previously. Now, you can go to the book of Joel and learn all about the battle of Armageddon through the prophet Joel. Joel is the one that says, I'm going to bring the nations down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I'm going to do judgment and do business with them there because they've divided my land. Throughout the prophets, the battle is talked about and commentary is given. And when he talks about the day, really, Joel, what Ezekiel's saying is when the day of the Lord comes, I've spoken about, 18 times in the Old Testament, the day of the Lord is mentioned. The day of the Lord, the day of the Lord, the coming tribulation period, that time of great consequence when there's a great battle at the end. That's what he's saying here. So we found that Antichrist is previously mentioned. Here we see the battle is previously mentioned. Does anybody know a battle mentioned with Russia elsewhere in the scriptures? Number 4, God's name is no longer blasphemed. Notice what Ezekiel says in chapter 38 after this war. My name and my holy name I will make known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let my holy name be profaned or blasphemed anymore. How can the battle of Gog and Magog be before the tribulation or in the middle of the tribulation if at the end of the battle there is no more blasphemy anymore? How's that possible? Matter of fact, Antichrist is referred to as the greatest blasphemer that's ever lived. And throughout the tribulation, the beast is described as blasphemous more than any other adjective. But here we see that Ezekiel says, once I'm done with this Gog and Magog invasion, my name will never be blasphemed anymore. How can that be any other time than at the beginning of the millennial kingdom, at the end of the tribulation? Can I get a witness and an amen here, folks? I'm trying my best up here. I'm going to start preaching it. Now, a Russian, this is a little bit tricky, so you got to have your thinking caps on. How many of you have your thinking caps on? Just look at the guy next to you, and you can find out whether he's got his thinking caps on. Highly suspicious, right? Think of this. I got to look at all these faces. Number 5, a Russian-led invasion accepts Gog as the head of Russia and Turkey. You say, how that? Well, if there were ever 2 long-term enemies, it's Russia and Turkey. They fought each other in World War I. They've always been against each other. But listen carefully to what I'm about to say because it's critical. Ezekiel 38:2 says it this way, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog. Now listen, I'm going to quote the wrong translation here. The prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. I've put the maps up there. Every conservative Bible atlas that you can find, any Christian conservative Bible atlas, all of them will tell you Meshach and Tubal are ancient names for Turkey. How can Gog be the prince of Rosh and Meshach and Tubal? And he repeats this 3 times. Now, this might lose you, but it shouldn't. This makes Russia an impossibility. If this is true, that the prince is the prince of Rosh and Meshach and Tubal, which are from Turkey, then what everybody needs to be looking at is when does Turkey and Russia align and become one? Because this battle can't happen until that happens. It's not going to happen, of course, because Magog is Turkey and Meshach and Tubal is Turkey. And Gog is Antichrist, not some preliminary invader from Russia before the tribulation. You say, Tim, I don't know about that. Well, how about this? Here's the list of Bible Atlas, conservative atlases, the Holman Bible Atlas, the Oxford Bible Atlas, the IVP Bible Atlas, the Zondervan Bible Atlas, the Macmillan Bible Atlas. They all say that Meshach and Tubal belong in Turkey. How can you be the prince of Russia, Meshach, and Turkey? Can't do it. This one's in the same boat. Number 6, a Russian-led invasion theory has a major problem with Libya and Sudan. Libya and Sudan are in North Africa. Now, the Russian invasion theory says that all the Muslims are going to be wiped out. Libya and Sudan will first be annihilated in the Magog invasion, But according to Daniel chapter 11, apparently they return again. Libya. So let's look at Ezekiel 38:5. You can see it in your notes. Cush, Sudan, and Libya, with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Libya and Sudan are two of the 8 nations that are mentioned in the coalition. Well, if they're completely wiped out, how come Daniel 11:43 says, he, Antichrist, will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt with the Libyans and Sudan in submission in the second half of the tribulation? How'd they get back into action if they were all slaughtered and annihilated before the tribulation began or at the middle of the tribulation? Oh, man. But forget everything I just said. If you don't remember anything, get this. That at the end of the Bible, Messiah's feet are on the ground. And at the end of the battle, if Jesus Christ is now standing on the ground, this has to be the Battle of Armageddon. You say, where's that? Ezekiel 38:19. Surely in that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, so that the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the beasts of the fields, all the creeping things that creep on the earth, and all the men who are on the face of the earth shall shake at my presence. Hebrew word for that presence is panim. It means the actual face and presence. And if that doesn't resonate with you, look carefully at Ezekiel 39 and verse 7. Here's another opportunity to get what I'm saying. God says, so I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. And I will not let them profane my holy name anymore. Then the nations shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. Now that phrase, Holy One of Israel, appears over and over. You need to go back to this phrase. I'm not done yet, so don't go in front of me. This is really good. What does this phrase say, folks? The nations shall know that I am the Holy One in Israel. It's the only time it's ever used. He's always the Holy One of Israel. It's repeated over and over and over in the Old Testament, but not here. This is the one proof text where God says, I've got my feet on the ground. If the second coming has occurred, ladies and gentlemen, there is no possibility that this comes before the tribulation or in the middle of the tribulation. And while 99.9% of all prophecy teachers will tell you this is about Putin and it's a preliminary invasion from some mysterious character with a bunch of Muslims that are going to wipe out the rest, and that are all going to get wiped out, this verse has Jesus Christ on the ground at the end of this battle, so it is the second coming. Now, if you flip to that next chart, I won't go through all the details of it. We put 9 specifics comparing the Battle of Gog with the Battle of Armageddon. They're in the land of Israel. They're both get invaders from the north. There's a great earthquake. The mountains are... In other words, if you carefully go down here, God doesn't make mistakes. Are you with me? And God's carefully showing us that the 2 battles of Gog and Magog and Armageddon are very much the same. Even at the end of both battles, God calls the fish and the birds and the animals to come eat the carnage. I've heard people tell me for years, the Battle of Armageddon and Magog, they don't have anything to do with each other. Well, look at that list carefully, and you tell me that. So I want to take a minute to move on to the identity of these nations a little bit further. The great benefit of Ezekiel 38 and 39 is that how it highlights Turkey. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Gog, Antichrist, of the land of Magog, Turkey, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, Persia, Cush, and Put, will be with them, also Gomer and Togarmah. So there's 8 nations. All of the nations are using their ancient names. And if you use, as I've mentioned, conservative Bible atlases, you'll find that all those names, Magog, Tubal, and all of those occur and are references, ancient names of Turkey. Now, let's look at this. This is not a complete list of all the nations. All right? If this was a complete list of all the nations, there'd be at least 10, because it's a 10-king caliphate that's going to invade. But we also know there's going to be a lot more nations than 10. By the end of the tribulation, the caliphate, Antichrist, will have swallowed up dozens of more nations that are part of their caliphate by the end of the tribulation period. So this isn't an exhausted list of everybody that's going to invade. What it is, it's a lopsided list as a proof text that Turkey's the leader. The undisputed ruler is Turkey. These names come out of Genesis chapter 10. They come out of Magog, was a grandson of Noah's, which we'll see in a minute. Meshach and Tubal were grandsons. Gomer and Togarmah was a great-grandson. And I noticed in Ezekiel 38:7, I don't know if we have that, Scott. We might not. No. Let's move on. Move on 2 more, Scott, to the map. Back up 1. Yeah. So let's just think of a couple things about this list. It includes Turkey and Iran, which means there'll be Sunni and Shia in this invasion, which is similar to what Daniel said when he said that the empire is going to be mixed. You'll notice it also lists Sudan and Libya, which is confirmed by Daniel 11, as we already discussed. You'll also notice that the list puts Iran in a superior position. Iran is listed as number 2. The Ayatollah said to Biden, "I'm not talking to you unless you lift the sanctions." Right? What'd Biden say? Sure. If you won't talk unless we lift the sanctions, we'll lift the sanctions. Did you see that they were actually began asking for $1 trillion before they negotiate? The Ayatollah said, that's how much money we lost under Trump, and if you don't give us that $1 trillion, we're not going to negotiate. I think that may have been pushed aside a little bit, but with this crew, you're never sure about what's really happening. Will there be nuclear weapons in the tribulation period? You betcha. Folks, it bothers me that our government is funding the worst Hitler on the globe against Israel. You can rest assured that the Ayatollah is every bit of evil as Hitler is. We're treating that crowd like they were Sunday school teachers. Zechariah talks about nuclear weapons, and it says this. Listen to this. Their flesh shall dissolve while they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall dissolve in their sockets, Zechariah 14:12, and their tongues will dissolve in their mouth. Of course it's nuclear weapons. From top to bottom, Iran has nuclear sites. Remember in the very beginning, this was all supposed to be for peaceful purposes, for electricity. How many of you remember that? When this whole controversy started with these nuclear weapons, they needed more electricity. They got more oil than anybody in the world, and all of a sudden they needed electricity. You don't even hear about that theory anymore. The Ayatollah wrote a book during the last negotiations. The book during the negotiations is called Palestine. It states Israel must be destroyed. And now, during the current negotiations, Iran just put out a video. This is one of the most diabolical regimes that the world is ever going to see. That's going to carry this fight and ultimately try to squash the entire Jewish state. You know, folks, Satan is lining up the nations as we speak. World needs to wake up. This isn't a game. Bible prophecy tells us that Turkey and Iran are going to do this. This is a map of Lebanon and Israel where Hezbollah supplies are. Of course, Iran funds the Hezbollah terrorist organization at hundreds of millions of dollars, and they have approximately 150,000 missile sites just above Israel's northern border. 150,000 missile sites. And of course, you have the story with Hamas going on now. This is a wall that Israel has recently completed with Hezbollah guys up on the other side, up in that perch up there, looking down on Israel. On some of those perches along the wall, there's a picture of the Ayatollah up, looking over Israel, because it's obvious that Iran is funding Hezbollah on Israel's northern border. This is an incredible task that Israel's putting up those walls. And of course, in Hamas, they've got an underground wall to stop the tunnels from coming over that they've recently had to build. And yet, Israel is doing fantastic economically and health and all the blessings that God, Israel is like got half their hand and their brain tied behind their back, and they're still outdoing everybody in the Middle East. Give God a round of applause for that.